Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Voice for Freedom podcast, a podcast of Arise. We're very honored today to have a special guest with us, Dr. Dan Diker. Welcome, Dr. Dan.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Dan Diker is president of the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. He's a research fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism at Reichman University. Immigrated to Israel in 1990 from the United States. Has a BA, Bachelor's in American History from Harvard, and a Master's in Counterterrorism from Reichman University in Israel, as well as a PhD in International Security Studies from the University of South Wales in the United Kingdom. So it's a real honor and pleasure to get to speak with you today. Dr. Dan, I guess is how we'll refer to you. For those of you that don't know, I'm Simeon Myers, the CEO of Arise, co-founder alongside my brother, Calev Myers, founder and chairman. And we also have Simone, our producer, here as well, who happens to be my wife. The topic that we'll be discussing today will be Iran and its proxies. But before we jump into that, Dr. Dan, just to give a little bit more background, I just want to ask a quick question about the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. What distinguishes JFCA, as we'll refer to it, from other centers and institutes in Israel?
Well, that's a great question, Simeon. Thank you to all the Myers for having me on your program. It's certainly an honor. And in fact, the name Arise is very appropriate to a regime that is dangling between arising and falling. So we have the opportunity to arise, and unfortunately, we also have the prospect of falling. So this is it's a wonderful title for this podcast. And the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs is dedicated to the effort to make the region more secure, more stable, and able to arise out of the chaos that the region finds itself in, especially with the amputation of a lot of the Iran's proxies and the earthquake that just took place in Syria, along with the extraordinary developments in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Yemen, and so that we at the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs refer to ourselves, and we are known as a do tank. And what a do tank does is it thinks out of the tank, just to complete the analogy of what think tanks do and how think tanks compete with one another. I think your question is very well put, because it suggests that all too frequently think tanks, whether in the United States, Europe, or the Middle East, have become a little bit of a commodity and very difficult to differentiate between one organization and the other. And differentiation has been a key word at the JCFA. And what we do is to strengthen Israel's security through out-of-the-box, innovative partnerships and alliances, connecting the Arab Muslim majority Middle East, Israel, to the West. And that presupposes a very important principle as JCFA, that we are indigenous to the Arab Muslim majority Middle East as a Jewish ethnic minority that has 3,600 years of history in this part of the world, and that anchor Judeo-Christian civilization. This is very important because it is a departure from many decades of what we believe is misbranding of Israel as sort of a post-Holocaust European Western enlightened implant in a hostile Middle East. And we see it very differently. Many of us speak Arabic, we think Middle East, we speak Middle East, and we think of ourselves as Middle Easterners that convey messages through personal face-to-face diplomacy, through digital diplomacy, as well as through research-driven policy analysis and influence, not only of our government and our lawmakers, but those of neighboring Arab countries in the region, as well as the Iranian opposition.
What percentage, that sounds so unique, that perspective and backdrop for all of your research and diplomacy efforts, starting from that starting point of acknowledging the unique and special identity of Israel and the Jews in Israel and the Jews in the Middle East. How unique and different is that from the majority of think tanks today? And why is that so important?
When we talk about the majority of think tanks today, are we talking about think tanks in Israel or in the United States and Europe?
I would say think tanks that are committed to solving these same problems.
Having been in the think tank world since 2002, with a short interregnum as former CEO of the World Jewish Congress, I can share with you that think tanks are their own best allies and supporters. People in think tanks love to read their own material, and then they have what I call the bicep kissing ceremony, where you produce something that's really a good piece of work. You kiss your bicep, and then you move on to the next topic without framing what is the campaign context. When I talk about campaign, I talk about influence campaign, impact campaign. What we try to do is not begin with the content, but begin with the influence. Whom do we want to influence? And how do we measure the influence? And what is the ultimate impact? And how do we measure the impact of the idea that we want to, or the message we want to convey? Once we understand what the problem is and what the solution is, then we back up into the type of content that we want to create. It is an unconventional approach to do tanking or think tanking, but I think it is the most effective approach, especially today, in which for some years now, the online digital world, the world of social media, allows us to quantify everything, allows us to target everyone or anyone that we want to target. So quantitative measurement of your highly qualitative research-driven policy documents and briefs and books and papers and updates is a much more available tool to put in the toolbox of the modern day think tank. But I would venture to say that the vast majority, if not all, of the think tanks that I know and the policy centers begin with content ideas that a small forum of men and women think are important to write about, and then they think about, well, whom else should we influence with this content, as opposed to the other way around, is to say, what's the problem? What do we think the solution is? What's the campaign? And then what kind of content should we author in order to maximize the quality of the campaign?
Okay, that's helpful. And how important do you think it is to start from the backdrop that you laid out, which is the acknowledgement of the Jewish people and the state of Israel as part of the greater, as you said, I don't remember the exact verbiage you used,
the Arab Muslim majority Middle East.
Yes. Can you drill down a little bit on that expression? I feel like that's a very unique perspective, and one that I think really needs to be, exposed to the world, and the importance of that.
Back in the end of the 19th century, or even in the middle of the 19th century, there were very prominent Christian theologians who had come to the Middle East with the idea of sharing Christianity and Western, what we call Christian and Western values and principles with this emerging Middle East in the beginning of the modern political period in the region, when it was still under the waning influence of the Muslim Ottoman Empire. And that began a type of civilizational revolution in which, and Professor Bernard Lewis of blessed memory talked a lot about this. He was the reigning expert in Western academia, in the academy, on the Middle East and the West. And he spoke a lot and wrote a lot about the profound Christian influence in the Middle East by Western theologians and historians and diplomats. And we know that Lord James Balfour and the British diplomatic corps, many of them were profoundly religious men and women of faith, of the Christian faith, and they were deeply involved in the re-engineering and the cartographic development and advancement of the modern Middle East. So with their entry and influence into the Middle East came a backlash at the end of the Ottoman Empire, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. For the first 25 years, you began to see this serious sort of civilizational explosion and backlash between tremendous Christian influence in the region from Western Christian influence, the adoption of Christian principles, theological doctrine by certain Arab elites. And at the same time, there was a liberation movement in what we call pan-Arabism or Arab nationalism in reaction to the Ottoman Empire, in which Arabs of newly Christian descent were very much part of even what they called Muslim committees for the sort of liberation independence of Arab peoples and Arab communities within what became known as of 1916, 1917, 1918, the former Ottoman Empire. And that's when Turkey became modern Turkey. And so within that tension emerges this 36 or 3,500-year-old people called the Jewish people, who have returned after 2,000 years of exile, as prophesied in the Bible. And we came originally from Christian Great Britain in order to reclaim our birthright here in the Holy Land. And so I use that as a background and as historical context to say that Israel, for the subsequent decades, forgot, I think, in the diplomatic discourse, in the international discourse, and in the discourse with our Arab neighbors, with newly defined lines like the Syrians in modern Syria, which was the center of both Muslim and Christian Arab nationalism. We neglected to remind them that we are actually the older sibling and that we should speak to them in Arabic. Instead, we spoke to them in the King's English or the Queen's English, and they saw us as colonialists and imperialists in contradistinction to the real former colonialists and imperialists that were the Ottoman Empire. So then you begin to see how today, in 2024, in the aftermath or following so many decades of this sort of Christian Muslim tension, the Jews, now Israeli Jews, did not identify as an indigenous 3,600-year-old people, ethnic minority within this since 632 in the emergence of Islam, within what is today 350 million Arabs, 22 Arab states, 57 Muslim states, and you have this indigenous Jewish minority, which is very much a profound historical part of the Middle East. That is our positioning at the JCFA. And when we meet our neighbors in capitals from the Middle East throughout Europe, under the radar, and we speak to them in Arabic as an historical Jewish indigenous ethnic group within the Middle East, they say to us, oh, you're speaking our language, you're speaking our culture. And then the entire conversation changes, and they relate to us quite differently than they would have Lord Balfour and the British Foreign Office in those years between 1918 and 1946, 47, when the British Empire pulled out under the Mandate for Palestine and left the destiny of this historic land to the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine and all the troubles that followed that for Israel, today coined as apartheid and as colonialist, imperialist. And we've said the best way to combat that is to rebrand, reposition ourselves and to differentiate ourselves, not as I said before, not as Americans, Europeans coming into a new Middle East reality, but as Middle Easterners within a Middle Eastern reality.
Thank you so much. That makes perfect sense. And I think, it's so significant to understand the historicity of all of this and the complexity of all of it. For our listeners, I'm sure you're picking up on some of that and hearing some of that. I feel like that backdrop and perspective is one that, probably some of the more moderate leaning countries in the region are starting to warm up to. I'd be curious, where they all fall at various levels. I think the Abraham Accords have opened up some of that, and it seems to be a progression that's moving forward. I'm not sure how accurate I am on that perception. You could shed some light on it.
You are. You're quite right. You're pointing to something very, very important, Simeon, and that is we had this discussion both yesterday at Israel's Knesset, at our parliament, where we were the official non-parliamentary partners together with the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, in a session called Israel's National Security Vision, with the inauguration of President Donald J. Trump and the Trump administration and its convergence with disinformation, anti-Semitism, and delegitimization. That's a long title, but what your question is pointing to is an identity revolution going on in the Middle East today. And we would argue at the JCFA, for the first time since the modern Middle East emerged back in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And as you know, the modern Middle East and the borders of the modern Middle East were drawn by French and British cartographers led by Mark Sykes and Mr. Picot from France, where they artificially divided up the Middle East according to European preferences. What is happening today is a revolution of identity among Arab countries, among the 22 Arab countries in the region, and I would term it as follows: between revolution and state evolution. Here you have these, I would say, arbitrarily drawn borders from 100 years ago, and if you look at Syria today, the Assad regime that is 50 years old since 1970, or 55 years old, has now for the first time in the last 55 years been overtaken by a rebel leader named Abu Muhammad al-Jelani, and he has Al-Qaeda and ISIS bona fides in history in his background, but his main goal, and this is a microcosm for other states, is to seek international legitimacy. And it is quite extraordinary to exemplify that idea, that with Israel having boots on the ground and bombing overhead of former Assad regime ammunition depots, strategic installations, as well as weapons depots, that in fact Jelani and his rebel leadership have not targeted Israel once within their own country. And it shows that they're really trying to redefine who they are, what they want, and what they certainly do desire right now is international legitimacy. And that means Israel, that means the United States, and that means, to a certain degree, Europe. This sort of summarizes an earthquake here that can be seen as a region struggling between revolution in all these countries and state evolution. What kind of states are Middle Eastern Arab states going to be? Are they going to continue to be inspired and motivated by the Nazi Soviet legacies that were the major fuel that fired up their identities in the first 50 years of the modern Middle East? Or are they possibly going to become more stable, a little bit more secure, and add elements of democracy and Judeo-Christian principles, if you will, of accepting the other? Jelani, by the way, said, "We will accept all minorities." That is not a statement that jihadists make, that we're going to accept Christian minorities, Maronite Catholic minorities, Druze minority, Kurdish minorities in their own country. So he's made that statement. And that indicates maybe, don't get too optimistic, but maybe that the influence that Christian diplomats and theologians and Israel's influence has brought them to understand that if they want to survive and they want to secure themselves and they want to stabilize their lives, that they might do well in changing their Weltanschauung, their worldview, from jihadism to a more Western orientation.
That's significant. It's and it's a really nice caveat, actually, into our topic today, which is Iran and its proxies. And I know that even in and of itself is a very loaded statement, because one might certainly make the distinction between Iran and the IRGC, for instance. What is the difference between those things? And then who are Iran and its proxies? So maybe you could just take us through a little bit about just a little backdrop on exactly what people are talking about for those that aren't as familiar with this topic when they say Iran and its proxies. Who are they talking about? Who are the players on the field?
I think before Dan gets into that, we should mention that he did write a book in 2008 called Iran's Race to Supremacy. Yeah, there it is, Dan. And in which he talked about Iran beginning to build up these proxies. And, here we are. Now the world knows what he was talking about. But he was one of the first people out there to talk about this and to frame it. So he's definitely the right guy to answer this question. One of my big questions, Dan, after you do explain that, regarding Iran and its proxies and who they are, is why does it seem that nobody in the West, I mean, even people within our communities of Israeli, advocacy in one way or another, been so focused on the Palestinian issue, while this looming threat has just been building behind us. Like no one really, except for Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, who is kind of like a voice crying in the wilderness. I didn't see a lot of NGOs, organizations, people just weren't focused on this like they should have. Do you agree with that?
I do. I do agree with that, Calev. In fact, back in 2007, there still was thinking that in the shadow of the worst terror attack against the West, meaning 9/11, and
right,
the killing of 3,000 Americans at the Twin Towers in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., that the notion of international terrorism, which President George W. Bush coined as the axis of evil, actually differentiated itself as a concept of Sunni extremist terrorism from Iran, which was looked upon, in 2001, in the 1990s, as a problematic, troublesome state that could be dealt with because it had not yet proved it had, even though Benjamin Netanyahu had actually been the first Western leader from Israel to warn a joint session of Congress in 1996, at the age of 46 years old, that a aspiring Iranian regime would become the biggest threat to the international order. This was considered an outlier. It was considered sort of a head scratcher, because at that time, if the five of us on this wonderful program remember, the Western world was stinging and still trying to recover from this massive terror attack against the United States in 2001, and then the subsequent terror attacks in Britain on 7/7, as well as the Madrid bombings of 2004, also by Al-Qaeda. So there was an ongoing, and then Bali, and then there was the shoe bomber, as you remember, that nearly brought down a major 747 U.S. airliner. So we were, in the Western discourse, we were overwhelmed and even obsessed with Sunni Osama bin Laden style network terrorism that didn't have a permanent home and only worked within these shadowy networks. And all that, by the way, came in the wake of the 1993 attempt to bring down the World Trade Center, which was also connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a precursor to Al-Qaeda. So nobody was thinking Iranian regime, really, I mean, on this level. And I, at that time, was a student of the late and great Professor Bernard Lewis, and also an informal student of the great Uri Lubrani, who was Israel's last diplomat, last ambassador to Iran under the Shah, and had to run away in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution in Iran. So this is sort of a runway into the consciousness, the public consciousness in the West, particularly in Washington, about, I would say, relative toothlessness of the Iranian regime versus this ascendant Al-Qaeda threat, and then America's response to that threat by the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq. That completely overtook the American military civil consciousness from 2001, certainly for the next nearly 10 years. The middle of it, Saddam Hussein was killed, many of the Taliban were killed, and then Osama bin Laden was taken out. So we were completely obsessed with that. And I remember Bernard Lewis at our family home in New York City giving a talk when this book came out in 2007. And he said, with his perfectly crafted Oxford and Cambridge accent, that he had never really focused in his book What Went Wrong, which came out after 9/11, New York Times bestseller for many, 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 many months. What Went Wrong did not talk about Shia extremist Islam, which was represented by the Iranian regime. He focused on Osama bin Laden. That was the problem. And so it was an overfocus on Sunni, Salafist, Osama bin Laden jihadism, and an underfocus on radical Shiite Iranian regime terrorism and subversion. That was basically the differentiation. Now superimpose on all of that, dear friends, the Palestinian issue, because the Palestinian issue became this sort of head fake overlay that both the Sunni countries and Iran were using as a football to distract the West from what the real ideological, religiously fueled enmity of both Sunni Islam, Osama bin Laden, and this emerging, extremely dangerous Shia Islam by a Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, who had returned from Paris and to Islamicize what had been a Marxist Leninist Islamic revolution in 1979. So you had all of this sort of ideological confusion that was taking up a lot of public headspace, and everyone was saying, well, let's solve it's the Palestinian issue. It's the Palestinian issue. And here we were, by the way, after 9/11, having been almost 10 years into the Oslo peace accords between Israel and the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, dedicated since 1964 to the mass murder and decimation of the Jewish state. But it had not been platformed as such. It had been platformed as a simple, relatively simple, possible to solve political territorial conflict between the strong Israelis and the weak Palestinians. Now, if there's one thing that the West, here's a secret, right? One thing that the West really goes for is the weak versus the strong, the underdog Rocky Balboa versus his much stronger opponent. And that played in very well in the Western policymaking circles about what was really wrong with the Middle East. Al-Qaeda was terrorism. Iran was an emerging danger, but immediate and medium-term terrorism wasn't ascribed or attributed to Iran the way it should have been. And what people did in the West was to say, you know what the real problem in the Middle East? It's the Palestinian issue. You've got to get the Palestinian people a state, and these tough, brusque, in-your-face Israelis, they're so damn stubborn. And meanwhile, we were being terrorized since the first day, and even before the PLO was established in 1964, by these Fedayeen PLO terrorists. Now, the PLO itself emerged out of the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is not a fact that's well known. Yasser Arafat was a Muslim brother, Ikhwan. He came out of the same Weltanschauung, Islamic jihadistic worldview, as Osama bin Laden at its root. But Arafat was very astute and very foxy, and he understood from his North Vietnamese and Cuban and other third world compatriots that in order to convince Americans of your virtue, you have to say things like, we're not shooting for the moon, we just want the freedom and justice for the Palestinian people. So here I've given you the two major ideological problems, one Sunni, one Shia, using a political football which the West was all too happy to catch and carry into the end zone, which is this Palestinian issue, which was just as much an issue of terrorism, of radical Islamic terrorism. But Arafat did a very good job at faking and tricking you to think that it was a political territorial problem.
And all the while, the West overlooking the true underdog in the greater story, which is, of course, Israel.
That's how the Iranian regime evolved into the most poisonous, enormous, gargantuan Poseidon of an octopus that had tentacles. We can talk about the tentacles of the Iranian regime. And it happened under our noses, and it began to strangle us in Israel, as well as, by the way, in the United States. Did you know, by the way, that the hijackers from 9/11 that were flown out on planes with the full knowledge of the U.S. government, they were then sheltered where? In Iran, in Tehran. So you've had Tehran behind the scenes in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that is basically the military infrastructure, both for internal military and terrorist jihadistic planning and operationalization. And then you have something called the Quds Force, which is their foreign arm. And they have been blowing things up, breaking things, and killing people since 1985, slowly but surely. And their tentacles evolved very much in the 90s and in the 2000s, while we were focusing elsewhere. So that's why I call it the head fake.
Do you make a distinction between, and I know Iranians, as far as I understand, or some of them, a lot of them, would like to make a distinction, at least, between IRGC and Iran. Do you make a distinction there? And if so, what would that be before we get into the proxies? Is there a difference there? Should the world view that there as being a difference there?
There is a difference. I mean, I remember Professor Lewis saying, be sure not to alienate the Iranian people. When we talk about Iran, the people of Iran, the 90 million people of Iran, say, don't conflate us with the mullahs in Qom, with the religious, fanatical, messianic, murderous regime and their military arm, which is the IRGC, with the Iranian people. So we at the JCFA, and it's a nuance, it's a cultural intelligence nuance that has to be made, should be very clear about when we talk about Iran in a negative, threatening sense, to talk about the Iranian regime, to talk about the mullahs, and to talk about their operators in the IRGC, which is, the IRGC is a huge corporate conglomerate, industrial military complex that basically controls all of the export of all of this murderous terrorism including in the back door of the United States, including the instruction to kill President Trump, including the instructions and the intention and the near success in assassinating former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, as well as former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and former National Security Advisor John Bolton. So I think the American political and public consciousness has not caught up enough with Iran's present, immediate, and ongoing threat to Western governments, beginning with the United States.
So let's jump into a little bit about who are the proxies, where do they stand now? I think it is, one thing that's worth noting is that, Iran is, of course, former Persia, who are the creators of the game of chess, right? And so I think it's safe to say that these are highly strategic people that have thought through a lot of these things, highly manipulative, and with, as you've said before, with the changes and advancements in technology, they now have access to the world with these various narratives and so on and so forth, and of course, revising of history and all of their various agendas. And I know that plays into this entire narrative. But could we just go back for a second and just talk a little bit about who exactly are the proxies? Where are they on the map, just for people that may not understand who they are and where they're located? And then from there, we can take it into, the state of things right now with this. I've heard you refer to it several times as an earthquake, which is certainly accurate. So who are we talking about when we talk about the proxies?
Well, what's very interesting about the proxies is that it's a unique high-tech model for the exportation of regional and international subversion and terror. There is no other model that is similar to the Iranian regime model. By the way, it's a very confusing model to the United States and to the Western way of thinking, because their major proxy force, which is Hezbollah, that are based in Lebanon, but they're not a Lebanese force. They're not a force that defends the interests of the failed state of Lebanon. They're not a force that fights for the Lebanese people. They actually sacrifice the Lebanese people in service of a radical eschatological Shiite or a Shiite eschatology that is completely dedicated to the reemergence of what they call the Mahdi, which is a messianic figure in Shiite eschatology, hidden or in occultation, that through all of this terror and subversion, it's kind of the Shiite version of Armageddon. And what confuses people in the West, if you take the main proxy Hezbollah, is that you will see in the New York Times and the LA Times and the Miami Herald, and you go across the country, they'll call it Hezbollah, the Lebanese militia. Well, they are not a Lebanese militia. They are an arm, a muscular arm of the IRGC in Tehran. They receive their funding from Tehran. They receive their monthly salaries from Tehran. They receive their instructions, their ideological inspiration, their weapons, their training, and their supply. So they're an Iranian regime tentacle or arm of the octopus that bases itself in Lebanon, and they've been doing that since 1982. That's a very difficult concept for Westerners to understand. Because
and I think it's crucial because it's really is their modus operandi across the board. So just as we talked about the difference between the Iranian people, as you said, and the IRGC, it's safe to say that this regime is not primarily concerned with the well-being of the Iranian people. They're concerned,
or the Lebanese people.
But it's the same, and so we see this. But this is where it really becomes important to understand for those that may not, in the Palestinian-Israeli crisis, if you would. It's exactly the same thing, and as well as it is with the Houthis in Yemen. This is not a regime that is in any way concerned with the well-being of the peoples of these nations or regions. They have a radical ideology that they're promoting, as you mentioned, this eschatological mission that they're on. But they've played the game very wisely in framing their endeavors, if you would, their terroristic acts as acts of protecting these populations or these regions. So very, very important to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if you look at the documentation that Israel Defense Forces, brigades, battalions have brought back from southern Lebanon and into southern, even towards central Lebanon, almost every single home in southern Lebanon has rockets, mortars, and high-grade ammunition that it has Persian writing on it. And so not only does Iran nor Hezbollah care about the men and women of the countries that they have invaded, kidnapped, and overtaken, but they have stored massive amounts of weapons and ammunitions under people's living rooms so that they become targets, legitimate military targets, according to any reading of international law. And they do it in service of this radical ideology. So they are just like Hamas in Gaza is sacrificing its own people by embedding its terrorist operators in hospitals, in mosques, in UN installations, in schools, and in residential buildings. And here we touch upon one of the major strategies of the Iranian proxies, and we just talked about two of them now: Hezbollah in the north, in Lebanon, and Hamas. Even though it's a Sunni, Hamas is a Sunni organization. The Iranian regime is a Shiite organization, but nonetheless, Hamas is supplied, financed, directed, inspired, believe it or not, against Israel in the West by its paymasters in Tehran. And that's exactly what the Hamas are doing to its own population. So when people talk about 42 or 44,000 people killed in Gaza, every single one of those people is the responsibility of the Hamas, because they have brought, with malice aforethought, a death and destruction on their own people with, strategic intention, because they know that the naive, or if not naive, internationally, ideologically aligned Western, left, even radical media is going to come down hard on Israel when, in fact, their target should be the Hamas and their paymasters in Tehran.
What is the solution to that problem? I think it's something that we're all trying to solve, every single one of us that are part of this conversation right now, and so many more. How do we get that ball across the finish line? How do we get the world to understand this? It's very frustrating on a perpetual day-to-day basis to watch, even the news on mainstream media and so on and so forth, and the way that they've bought into these narratives. What do you see as the solution to shedding light on this issue of Iran and proxies, how they operate this strategy of human sacrifice and lawfare and all these different things? What do you see as the solution there?
The answer, the response, the solution to this type of deception warfare that emanates out of Iran, the Soviets, and the Nazis is to take over the means of production and the distribution of social media today, as well as what Fox was supposed to be, and to a degree what Fox is doing and what Newsmax is doing. This is a war. This is a media jihad that the West has got to get its arms around and do jujitsu and change the balance of power within the American media and certainly in social networks. This is a high-tech war also of bots and avatars, and it's a war of perception. And let's be very clear, since the United States defeated the Soviet Union in a war of deception, information, and misinformation and disinformation, the United States had at least 12 civilian offices in Washington that were involved in influence operations in order to convince the Soviet public and the American publics that the Soviet Union was an axis of evil and the United States was the coalition of the good. This is exactly what has to happen today. Unfortunately, after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, America and the West and Israel included in that coalition forgot that we continued to face an unrelenting ideological war against our enemies. And we figured that if we could just we could defeat Palestinian terror, if you could defeat and kill Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, and ultimately, even today, look at Yahya Sinwar, the murderous Nazi former head of Hamas until, thank God, he was killed, as was Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah, of Iranian Hezbollah, as well as Ismail Haniyeh, who is one of the external leaders of the Hamas. It's not enough to assassinate. You have to de-radicalize and re-educate. That's the war we're in. It's I think, far more dangerous and consequential than just the military or counterterror war, because people live and die by perceptions, feelings, ideas, and the like.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, and we are going to have to start kind of winding down here. So I think it's important to just get to a couple other quick things. Obviously, this is such an important conversation. I think we could go on and on for hours. There are so many layers to this, and it's very, very interesting. Go ahead, Calev. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, my question would be, as you know, Dr. Dan leads a fantastic do tank, as he called it, here in Jerusalem. One of the things that they do, I know, is write policy papers, particularly for the Israeli government. But putting on your American hat for a minute, Dan, if you had 3 minutes in an elevator with President Trump and an opportunity to give him your advice as to what his policy should be vis-a-vis Iran over the next 4 years, what do you tell him?
No tolerance policy for terror and subversion. Either I would tell him in the elevator from the ground floor to the 40th floor of Trump Tower on 5th Avenue and 57th Street in New York City, there's probably a minute and a half, as opposed to the 3 minutes you may have suggested, is to say to Ali Khamenei, the ailing Ali Khamenei, the Ayatollah of Iran, Mr. Ayatollah, you have X number of weeks to rid yourself of your nuclear program, because we know that you are trying to manufacture and retrofit ballistic missiles and infuse them with uranium and plutonium. If you do not end this, that will be verifiable by the United States. We are going to destroy you. We are going to destroy your regime, and we are going to destroy your energy reserves, and we're going to destroy your nuclear program. And then the Iranian people will be free to choose their own democratically elected government and future of freedom. The president can do that. The president was able to get North Korea to back off of its nuclear program. The president is feared across the Middle East as the what's called al-Faras al-Asil, which is called the gallant thoroughbred horse. And the horse, the strong horse, if you will, within Arab Muslim culture and Arab Muslim history and political thought, is really a very substantial, consequential creature that is known for his muscularity, for his power, and that is what Israel is thought of today, and that is what President Trump is thought of today across the Middle East. So the president has the power, the moral and political will in order to impose America's will based on Judeo-Christian values and the principle of freedom for the West and even for the peoples of the Middle East and the rest of the world, to impose that on these murderous regimes. And I think that today the Israelis have done such a phenomenal job in flipping the entire balance of power, or shifting the balance of power in the Middle East from the bloodied and injured and wounded horse to the strong horse 1 year after the worst single-day attack, mass rape, murder, maiming, and kidnapping of any Western country in modern political history, to become the strong horse. So together, Israel and the United States, as the two strong horses in the region, can impose their will and cause regime change in Iran. That is in our view, the single most important mandate for the West, because the Iranians are unquestionably the major subverters and terrorizers of the international community today. And President Trump has the power to change that dark reality into one of light and hope.
Fantastic. So, two more questions. One, with regard to this issue and President Trump and sort of where this is all going, how serious is the threat that he has recently made with regard to the hostages, which is work that Calev and I, as you know, have been very, very involved with over the course of the last year. But how serious is that threat, and what are the potential outcomes that he's talking about if these hostages are not released? Where could this go? What could he do when he says he's going to unleash hell? In your opinion, how serious is that, and what could it look like?
We don't know what that means, because Israel has been fighting tooth and nail against the murderous Iranian proxy Hamas for 14, 15 months now. There are still Americans being held in the dark dungeons of Hamas, in these tunnels. There are a number of scenarios that the president could be talking about. Could very easily see American special forces going in and attacking Hamas based on very strong intelligence, what's left of the Gaza Strip. We could see America leveraging the type of major influence that it has on Qatar and on Egypt to end it and bring all the hostages back. America has tremendous leverage on every country in the Middle East, and particularly Qatar. And one of the major mistakes, in our view, that the outgoing administration has made is that they did not force their will and their power on the Qataris. And that is why the negotiations have not gone well. The Hamas has been playing with everyone. The Hamas has no personal or collective interest in freeing the hostages. In their view, it's their only key to survival is to keep the hostages. But America can shift that by telling the Qataris, listen, we are going to move our military base, which constitutes hundreds of millions and billions of dollars of revenue and power projection of the Qataris, from Doha to Saudi or to the UAE. And I think that the Qataris would work very promptly in order to threaten the Hamas with complete cutoff of Qatari funds. The president has that type of leverage. And knowing the president is a deal maker, he's a financial expert, he likes financial pressure as a major strategy. So you can use a combination of counterterrorism and financial levers in order to fulfill his promise to let all hell break loose if those hostages are not returned by the time he's inaugurated on January 20th, 2025.
And that is a nice caveat into what was going to be my next question, which is about Qatar. You know, you authored that book seemingly way ahead of its time regarding Iran and its tentacles, and we're seeing that play out in real time on the global stage. What is the role of Qatar in all of this? You know, they don't get a lot of publicity, but obviously they have tentacles everywhere, seemingly in every facet of society, certainly in buying up mainstream news agencies. They own more land in Great Britain than the royal family. They own, sports teams, professional sports teams around the world. And they seem to be playing this game very, very well as we know that I believe it's the largest United States Air Force base is in Qatar. So what is their role in all of this? I feel like that's not so clear to the world right now.
Right. The Qataris are really the shadow jihadists. They are Muslim Brotherhood government known as a bank with a flag. They are a bank with a flag. So instead of using the octopus analogy, I would say they are a network of banks and media outlets. And they are very skilled and flush with cash to finance the worst propaganda machine in the international community called Al Jazeera. And this is exactly what the West has to pay very close attention to and of which to be mindful in order to copy their strategy and throw it right back at them in terms of Western messaging, uncovering of the jihadi Muslim Brotherhood propaganda. But if you look at the Al Jazeera network and the hundreds of millions of dollars all over the world in many languages, beginning with Arabic, and trying to continue to try to indoctrinate 350 Arabs around the Middle East, and also hundreds of millions in the West through Al Jazeera US, where you have, well-heeled, well-dressed men and women who get very good salaries in order to promote this Al Jazeera line, which is, propaganda at best, sort of this sort of fascist propaganda at worst. This is the role of Qatar. The sporting teams is soft power. Al Jazeera is soft power. All of this are relationships and influence in order to buy loyalty and to convince people that they're legitimate. Because who doesn't love sports? Sports is the main course of Western culture. And here these Muslim Brotherhood Galabia wearing Qataris have bought up the flagship, the apple pie and Chevrolet, if you will, of Western culture, and that is sports teams. And they also have bought up many Middle Eastern programs at universities. They have invested, according to Charles Small, the chairman of ISGAP, or the executive director of ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism and Policy. The ISGAP has been leading the charge to uncover Qatari funding and financial kidnapping of American universities, and particularly Middle East programs at American universities, including Ivy League universities, and including universities across the United Kingdom, whether it's Cambridge, London School of Economics, King's College, University of Manchester, Paris, Texas A&M, Carnegie, Georgetown, Cornell, you name it. They have invested, according to Professor Small, tens of billions of dollars to dominate the thinking of faculty and students at these universities. And that is a national security threat to the United States and to the Western world as it stands today. So we've got to get up and get sharp and become mindful and get foreign funding led by the Qataris out of America's finest universities.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. And, so there you have it. I mean, folks, we've got to keep our eyes on Qatar. And of course, we've got to keep our eyes on Iran and what's taking place there. Just winding down here, I want to thank you again so much, Dr. Dan Diker, for taking the time out of your very, very, very busy schedule to meet with us. I'd love to have you on again in the future as we watch, this earthquake, as you've referred to it several times, that's taking place in Syria and really across the Middle East. And the shockwaves of that, we know, are going to take place across the Middle East as well as across the entire world. Folks, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedules to listen to this podcast. Once again, this is the Voice for Freedom podcast, a podcast of Arise, and we're wishing you guys a very, very good day and a peaceful start to your new year.